Okay, today's Scorer lecturer is Tim Clutton-Brock, FRS. And Tim is the Prince Philip Professor of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology at Cambridge University in Britain and head of the Large Animal Research Group in the Department of Zoology there. He's had an extraordinary career in behavioral ecology, working on long-term studies of known individuals, of red deer, sow sheep and meerkats. He wrote a benchmark book in 1991 on the evolution of parental care, and he has another book in press at the moment on the evolution of mammal societies. He's written numerous papers in Nature and Science, and is the only scientist I know who got the front cover of Science and the front cover of Nature in the same week. He's written, and he has accrued enormous numbers of grants during his career, and then was asked to show the rest of the world how he did that. And for those of you who are writing grants, I suggest you go to a website entitled Survival Strategies for Science, Scientists, and type in Tim Clutton-Brock. And let me just take you through a couple of highlights of that before I let you start. His first idea is that no one owes you anything. This is your independent attempt to get blood out of a stone. His second idea is that all sentences must have a subject, verb, and object. And his last piece of advice is if you don't get the grant, don't be paranoid. And with that, I would like to introduce Tim Clutton-Brock.
Well, I think I'm fairly paranoid after that introduction, but thank you very much, Tim, for one way or another. I'm going to give a rather different talk this time. My first lecture was really to try to join up the dots about how we understand the different components of mammal societies. And this time I'm going to talk about a very specialized set of mammal societies, a very specialized set which are cooperative breeders. And cooperative breeders I take to be species where typically the offspring of one, or in some cases more, individuals are reared altruistically by non-breeding other individuals. And this obviously raises major questions about why animals should give up breeding themselves and raise the offspring of others. And that's the interest in this rather small collection of species. Like my comparative work, this work is the result, the work I'm going to talk about is the result of a lot of other people's efforts. Here are some of the main collaborators with the Meerkat Project: Marta Manser, who co-directs the Meerkat Project with me, Sarah Hodge, who's worked as a postdoc, Tom Flower, who worked as a field director and then a student, Ann Carlson, who did the hormone work for us, Andy Young, who worked on dispersal, Joan Madden, who worked on individual strategies, then various other people that I can't get photographs of, Andy Russell, Joran Spong, who did the genetics, and Mike Kant, who has principally worked with some of the other species that I'll be talking about. Cooperation, people interested in cooperation tend to divide cooperation into two categories. Indeed, they divide interactions between animals into four categories inter all. So you can have situations, the greatest number of interactions are cases where one individual does something that has a benefit to itself and a cost to someone else. Very, very common. This is what most animals spend most of their time doing. We may or may not get cases where they do something that has a cost to them and a greater cost to someone else. I'm not going to talk about those interactions. These are very common. These are probably very rare, but I'm not going to talk about those at all. I'm going to talk about interactions where there are positive results to at least one group member. And these are commonly regarded as cooperative. There are two different kinds. There are cases where you do something that has a benefit to you and a benefit to the individual you're cooperating with at the same time. And I call that mutualistic. And I'm happy to talk about mutualism being an intraspecific interaction as well as an interspecific. I'm not too bothered. Some people talk about this as beneficially mutualistic. who cares? This kind of situation is common. It's not difficult to evolve. If you have a situation where doing something has net benefits to you as well as benefits to another, you may often cooperate. So, for example, animals commonly cooperate to catch prey together. They both benefit from it. In a number of species, males benefit to liberate, to take over females from other males. They both cooperate on it. So mutualistic interaction is very common. And then you have a much rarer set of cases where it's altruistic, where you do something that has a cost to you and a benefit to someone else. Now I'm going to cast into this system immediately the patterns of reproductive cooperation. And firstly, there are a group of species that I refer to as communal breeders, like lions, and in some populations of mice, where several breeding females share care of combined litters. It's commonly the case, but by doing this, they reduce the peak energetic load of looking after their litters at the same time. So if you have two females lactating to a whole pile of lion cubs, if they're slightly out of sync, there's an offsetting of the maximal load of energetics. There are also other benefits that if one female doesn't have enough food or is wounded, there's someone else to take up the slack. So communal breeders, I'm not really going to talk about further. They are an example of mutualistic, of intraspecific mutualism. Don't think there's any great problem about how you maintain systems like this. If you look across mammals generally, communal mutualistic breeding is common. Communal breeding is not very common, commonly occurs among relatives, but it also occurs where you have in polygynous systems where individuals are not closely related to each other. If you look at the phylogenetic, if you use phylogenetic analysis to look at the origins of communal systems, you find that communal systems, communal breeding systems, will evolve in polygynous species as well as in monogamous species. The evolution of these systems, as you might expect, is not restricted to cases where there's a high degree of relatedness between group members. I'm going to be talking, the animals I'm going to talk about are rare and are specialized, and are the cooperative breeders, of which the meerkats that I study are one case. Here in most of these, you have one breeding female per group who does most of the breeding, assisted by a caste of non-breeding helpers and typically mated to a single male. So one dominant female monopolizes reproduction and subordinates act as helpers. And the question in this, the central question in these systems, since the subordinates are not actually breeding themselves, they're spending in some cases all their lives helping other individuals. What do they get out of it? The other interesting, the sort of more general point about systems of this kind is that they are on the way to being eusocial societies, as in the ants and wasps and a number of social insects. Here you have effectively a similar system scaled up. So in these systems you have typically one breeding female. Some cases you have more than that. Typically it's a modified female who is often unusually large workers, helped by a vast cast of helpers who are in almost all cases all female. So a much larger colony size than you get in the cooperative vertebrates. And in a proportion of these cases, the helpers are sterile and so cannot breed at all. In other species, some of them get to breed and some of them breed occasionally. In these systems, commonly females store sperm, so they mate once with a male and they use his sperm to fertilize any other queens that they produce, and the workers are, in many of the species, haploid and so just have the mother's genes. So where do cooperative societies evolve? I'm going to take a couple of minutes to say that, though people who went to my first lecture will have had part of this before. Cooperative breeding systems occur widely. Eusocial breeding systems occur widely in invertebrates. Among the vertebrate cooperative breeding systems, occur in quite a number of birds, like pied babblers, and then in a variety of mammals, including both carnivores like wild dogs and herbivores like the mole rats. These are Damaraland mole rats in the right-hand picture. There are four main radiations of cooperative breeders in mammals. The first cooperative breeding occurs in a variety of the canids. So it occurs in foxes, jackals, bat-eared foxes, and wild dogs, and a number of other species as well. These are typically species which are monogamous and which produce relatively large litters. It also occurs in the marmosets and tamarins. These are the smallest, the callitrichid primates are the smallest of the monkeys. They're a radiation found widely in the New World, which uniquely among monkeys produce twins. The third main radiation is, and the marmosets feed on a wide variety of foods, of fruit, gum, and some insects. The third main radiation of cooperative breeding in mammals is in the mongooses, where it occurs in a number of species, but these are the ones that are best known. Yellow mongooses, which are solitary feeders but social breeders. Dwarf mongooses, which, like meerkats, live in groups of, their groups are slightly smaller than meerkats, but they live in groups with one dominant male and one dominant female. Single female monopolizes reproduction. Meerkats, which live in groups of typically between 15 and 30, but occasionally up to 50. Again, one breeding female, one breeding male, and a caste of supporters. And then, interestingly, I'll come back to this at the end, banded mongooses, a species found in rather more mesic areas where multiple females and multiple males breed, and group sizes are rather larger than in the two species which show reproductive suppression. So what I'm going to do in this, and finally, fourthly, in the mole rats are a herbivorous radiation. They all live below ground. They include some species of solitary and then a variety of species that are social, including the most beautiful mammal of all, the naked mole rat, which is a strikingly attractive number in the left-hand corner, and Damaraland mole rats. The naked mole rat comes from the deserts of the Horn of Africa, and its counterpart in southern Africa is the Damaraland mole rat, which comes from the Kalahari. Then there are a variety of other species which vary in the degree of sociality. All are fossorial. They live almost exclusively above ground. Some live in more mesic areas, others in more arid areas. The species living in more mesic areas tend to be solitary. Those in the more arid areas tend to live in groups. They have eyes, but they're more or less totally blind, and the colonies inhabit extensive subterranean tunnel systems that give them access to the tubers of desert plants. So if you're living in a desert, the only resources for much of the year are the storage organs of plants, and you need a big system of tunnels to get access to them. So what I'm going to do in this lecture is to deal with 5 questions. I'm going to, first of all, for people who didn't come to the other lecture, say a bit about where cooperative breeding occurs. And I'm going to deal with 3 questions, principally, with 4 questions in total, dealing principally with meerkats. Why don't helpers disperse? Why don't they leave the group and go off and breed themselves? Why don't helpers breed if they're going to stay in their natal group? Why do they leave it to the dominant female to breed? Why do helpers help? Why do they really spend much of their time and considerable energy helping the dominant female? And then in the latter part, I'll be talking about what the consequences of cooperative breeding are for other aspects of strategies. So, where do cooperative breeders occur? And I've already, I will go through this pretty shortly. All monogamous mammals, all cooperative breeding mammals, and by cooperative in the sense I'm using it in a narrow definition of species where the young produced by a small proportion of females are reared by non-breeding group members. They're all derived from monogamous ancestors, and they're almost all monogamous with a high degree of paternity certainty. It's also the case that you don't get litter, you don't get cooperative breeding arising in monogamous species that produce single young. So all the species where you get cooperative breeding are derived and still occur in litter-bearing species. So where you get good radiations, which are extensively monogamous, for example, the gibbons, you don't get the evolution of cooperative breeding, and this is probably because there's no point in not breeding to help a female that's just going to raise a single young. A female can deal, you can't greatly increase the reproductive output of a single female if she's producing a single young by not breeding and helping her. It's only where females have a higher fecundity level than that there's a trade-off, there's a benefit to cooperative breeding. The other characteristic of cooperative breeders is the males have long tenure in these species, so males breed for a relatively long time, so members of different generations commonly have the same father. I'll come back to that. And there's also a relationship between cooperative breeding and challenging environments. So many of these species, in particular in the meerkat, in the mongooses and the mole rats, the most cooperative species are associated with deserts. So just to show you some examples of what's going on in cooperative breeders, dominant males and dominant females in the group produce a very high proportion of young. This is comparing cooperative breeders with other social species. There's a very high degree of skew in cooperative breeders, both among females and among males. So the single mother and the dominant male and the dominant father in cooperative breeders have produce a very high proportion of young. Skew is very large. And it's also that the case that the tenure of males in these species, this is the duration in years of the breeding success of a single male, the domination of a single male, is very long. Now, as a result of the fact that a single female breeds, she produces a litter which is commonly fathered by the same male. Males have long tenure and high skew. The result of all that is kinship. The average degree of relatedness in these societies is very high. So I showed you this slide the other day, which compares average relatedness between resident group members or between recruits, if you prefer it, in meerkats. In meerkats, again, single male, single female, female producing litters, individuals sticking around for quite some time, generate an average coefficient of relatedness between group members of 0.4. Now, if you compare this to other societies where females remain in their natal group and females are still all commonly closely related to each other, the coefficients of relatedness are much lower. So, for example, in lions, multiple females breed, multiple males breed, the tenure of males is relatively short, and all of that forces the average degree of relatedness down. Similarly, in baboons, multiple females breed, multiple males breed. Males have relatively short tenure, there's not very high skew, and here average relatedness is even lower. The point I want to make is that the characteristic of cooperative breeders is that they have very high degrees of relatedness within groups, and that is a common phenomenon in most cooperative species, so that in birds it's been shown, in birds it evolves in monogamy, there's an association with monogamous species, but it's confined, it is largely confined, there's a bit of an argument about it here now in some species, to species with very high paternity certainty, like the babblers. In insects, the evolution of eusociality is confined to monogynous ancestors. These are species where one breeding female mates and stores sperm from a single male. And the suggested explanation for this is you don't get individuals not breeding and spending their lives helping other individuals unless their relatedness to the individuals they're helping is somewhere of the same ballpark as their relatedness to their own offspring. So this is Jakob Boomsma's explanation of the evolution which was originally applied to sociality applies to cooperative breeding too. And unless it's the case for ego that their relatedness to other young that they're helping to rear is roughly similar to that to their own offspring, then they, if this is higher, they help this. They produce their own offspring, and they only help their parents produce subsequent offspring if they are the offspring of a monogamous pair, generating a value here which is almost as close as a relatedness to subsequent individuals they're going to rear, which is approximately the same as that to their own offspring. There is a quirk to this, because it's obviously going to be the case that this is likely to be slightly lower than this, if it's the case that your mother has a much higher chance of breeding successfully than you do, and this more or less holds, so perhaps it drops to 0.4. You may well still help your mother breed, because that's much more productive in producing, in replicating your genotype. The suggestion that I've just given you that there's a relationship between cooperative breeding and harsh conditions is something that has comparatively recently been demonstrated in birds too, where Dustin Rubinstein and Paul Yates have shown that the relative frequency of cooperative breeders throughout the globe is related to the inter-year variability in rainfall. So cooperative breeders tend to be found, not universally, but there tends to be an association between cooperative breeders and deserts and other harsh environments. And the exceptions to that are mostly species living in niches that are difficult in some way. Just to deal with one other complexity here, it's important, one question that's commonly asked is why are there no eusocial vertebrates? Why have we never moved to vertebrates that have breeding systems like ants with a high degree of specialization, a specialized queen which is perhaps much larger than everyone else, and specialized sterile workers? And the answer to this was produced in outline by Andrew Burke. And ultimately, the bottom line on this is that the degree of specialization is likely to be a consequence of very large colony size. And you never get vertebrates moving up into the same sorts of colony sizes as you do the social invertebrates for straight energetic reasons. The individuals require more food. And the argument behind the situation is that between Burke's argument on this is that as colony size increases, the per capita chances of individual helpers, of individual subordinates acquiring the breeding position progressively go down. So in very large colony sizes of thousands, the per capita chances of subordinate taking over the position of the breeding queen are very, very low, and so they specialize in being helpers, and vice versa. As colony size increases, the caste of helpers that support the dominant female allow her to have a greater and greater reproductive output, and so the queens become more specialized. So the suggestion here is that the degree of specialization we see in societies is a consequence of colony size. I think we do see that, so that most of the birds, for example, are not very specialized. As you move out to the mammals, in particular with mole rats with much larger colonies, you get a greater degree of specialization and some degree of difference in size between breeders and non-breeders. And then as you move to the insects with much, much larger colonies, you get a situation where you get a high degree of specialization. So people who came to my first talk will be familiar with much of this argument. I'm going to move on now to talk about the next three questions, which I'm going to group together. And I'm going to group together because I'm going to talk about them all in relationship to our work on meerkats. And those are the three questions that people ask about cooperative breeding systems. Why don't the helpers disperse? Why don't they breed? And why do they help? I'm going to talk about this. I'm now going to move to talking about meerkats in particular. So meerkats are desert breeding mongooses. They are restricted to the greater area of Kalahari sand, and they obtain most of their food by digging in the sand, most of their food being invertebrates and small vertebrates. Almost all the films of meerkats and many of the pictures give you the idea that they are this high. Actually, they're about that high. So they are an awful lot smaller than people think. They live in groups of up to 50. Each group has a range of typically between 3 and 10 square kilometers. So each group has a huge range. It moves over a large distance, sleeping in different places in different nights. And within that range, they commonly have 2 to 5 different sleeping burrow systems, and they have, in many cases, thousands of bolt holes, and they appear to know where they all are. So don't think of meerkats. Do distinguish between them and rodents. Rodents are intellectually challenged animals that live in a relatively stable environment. They typically occupy a particular burrow. They don't move far. When you're thinking of meerkats, think miniature wild dogs or think primates. Don't think of a resident breeding species. So in meerkat society, there's one dominant female who is usually a natal animal unless she is a founder member of a new group. There's one dominant male who is usually an immigrant who has moved into the group or is the founder member of a new group. And then there's a caste of male and female helpers of up to 3 to 4 years. Dominant females throw out, evict all other females between the ages of 2 years and 3.5 years forcibly, and you get no older females left in the group, and subordinate males leave and search for evicted females at the same time. They feed on invertebrates that they dig up, and to get invertebrates, scorpions, centipedes, ants, beetles, lizards, and so on, they have to dig for them, and they commonly dig quite deep. And obviously there's a problem that while you're digging for luscious things under the ground, you leave your own most luscious parts exposed above ground for any predator. Predation is common, so that in one population of meerkats that we worked on, 60% of adults were eaten each year. So groups only kept going by rapid breeding all the time. So the potential for high predation rates is very high indeed. And as a result, meerkats are enthusiastic bird watchers. They stand up commonly in the areas where predation is very high. There's a sentinel on duty for most of the day, and when the sentinel sees a predator, there's a complex system of alarm calls, which Marta Manser has studied in detail. So guards are up, and guards keep a lookout for predators when the group is foraging. The meerkats show extensive reproductive cooperation. So apart from sentinel duty, they also dig tunnels and keep the bolt holes open throughout their range. And then with reproduction, when a dominant female gives birth, it's commonly the case that several females will lactate to the young. The young are then kept at the natal burrow for about 3 weeks before they emerge. And over the time that they're at the natal burrow, someone babysits while the group is foraging each day. So the group goes off and leaves the natal burrow. One individual or sometimes 2 individuals stay behind, and they defend the pups. And if neighboring groups come, or neighboring predators such as other mongooses or snakes, the babysitter will defend the pups with their lives. So you commonly see neighboring groups trying to dig out pups from a burrow that they visited. They kill pups whenever they get an opportunity to, and you get the babysitter sitting in the bottom trying to keep them off. And babysitters sometimes get killed in this way, and occasionally, quite commonly, pups get killed too. But the babysitters sit and remain while the group is feeding, so they don't feed for 24 hours at a time, and they lose about 3% of body weight during that time. So no one babysits for more than one day at a time. After pups are about 3 weeks old, they come out to the surface and they spend about a week on the surface. They're protected by the babysitter, and then they start moving with the group, and they're fed for the first 3 months of life by all group members, both males and females. I should have said males babysit just about as much as females. So after the pups move, they're fed, and the helpers and adults give to them somewhere around 40% of all the food they find. So it's a very complex extent of cooperation. There are a few other mammals that have such an extensive network of cooperation. That was really why I picked them. There are slanderous suggestions that I picked them because they're extremely cute, and this appealed to the general public and to filmmakers, but that is, of course, entirely wrong. My interests were primarily in the fact that one can collect data very close to them, because the other point about meerkats is that they tolerate you. They learn to tolerate you very closely. So our meerkats have now been, we've been working in the same area for 22 years. Our meerkats are now being used, this is not photoshopped in, they're used to being observed very closely indeed. Various people always ask about this. Isn't this a problem? Isn't it the case that you're affecting their behavior? And I wouldn't like to say we make no effect on their behavior, but what I'd say is if you work on an animal that is scared of you, if you hide behind a tree, you generate a situation where the animal's looking at you all the time, and that has a much greater effect on its behavior. Our animals, on the whole, are rather like someone you talk to at a cocktail party who doesn't really want to talk to you. They're really much more interested in what's going on behind you than what you're actually saying to them. And this is the situation. And the fact that our meerkats, when they first arrive blinking from the burrow into the light of day, virtually all the members of our population, we work on 15 to 20 groups, virtually all those individuals, the first thing they would have seen is one of us. And they'd have seen the babysitter being entirely unbothered about us. So we have a situation where all members of 15 to 20 groups are really not bothered about us at all. Their reaction to us is very much the same as the reaction of a sheep, which is of a rabbit, which is raised in a field with sheep. They don't want to be trodden on. They are a bit nervous if you run, but they are otherwise really entirely unbothered about us, and they'll climb on us when they see an advantage in doing so. And this means that we have been able to persuade them to climb onto electronic balances at wish. We do that with either crumbs of hard-boiled egg, and we'll use half a hard-boiled egg to feed a whole group, or with water in a rabbit thing. So here's one of the members of the project enticing meerkats onto scales. Here are the scales. Here's a group, and we feed them. We get each of them onto the scales in turn. And the problem is not actually on the whole to get them onto the scales. The problem is to prevent them getting all onto the scales at the same time. But it's and we've done this now. And as I say, sometimes they just climb up you and go on guard on your head while you're doing this. You reach your final degree of acceptance in a meerkat as a meerkat watcher is when you're sitting with the meerkats and you feel a warm, wet feeling on your thigh, which is the male anal marking you, which commonly happens. And one of the best cases that I've commonly seen is when the film teams get a bit close, the male sometimes goes up and anal marks right across the lens. It always gives me great pleasure to see that. But this does mean that we can do a number of things. We paint them all up with ladies' hair dye. So if you ever look at the meerkat films, you'll see dark blotches on our meerkats, and these allow us to recognize individuals. And they're entirely cool about allowing us to interfere and to pick up their pups. So you can see here that they're a bit concerned, the pups yelling, pups being picked up to be marked, and we take a tail tip as soon as we can after birth, which goes into our system. All the individuals in our populations now genotyped, they're mostly hormonally profiled, and we have a multi-generational genetic pedigree as a result. So, enough about meerkats. What do meerkats actually do? So, individuals don't disperse from their natal groups. Females never leave their natal groups unless they're forced out by their mother. We've never seen females leave a natal group voluntarily. Why not? The answer's reasonably straightforward, and I don't propose to show you a lot of data here. There's a shortage of vacant territories. The whole area of the Kalahari that we work in is a network of meerkat territories. There are high mortality risks of dispersal. A very high proportion of individuals that leave their natal group and move off die. There are low chances of breeding success once you're established. Members of small groups, as I'll tell you in a moment, do very badly. They show high mortality and low breeding success. And so your options, if you're a female, it's much better to remain in your natal group than to leave it. So there's a situation where this is partly related to the fact they're highly social animals, because females are never allowed to immigrate into established groups by the resident females. And the dispersing individuals that commonly disperse in splinter groups of somewhere between 2 and 6 are taking on, or if they're going to do so aggressively, they're taking on much larger resident groups in most cases, so they have little chance of displacing them. So it's not difficult to understand why these animals don't voluntarily disperse. Males, however, why females don't voluntarily disperse. Males do disperse voluntarily at about the same age, and that's because none of the most of the other group members are their sisters or other relatives, and they won't breed with them. So as in many other mammals, there's strong discrimination by females against familiar or related males, and males consequently have to leave to breed, otherwise they won't get to breed at all. So why don't subordinates breed? Well, the straightforward answer again here is reasonably straightforward. Well, straightforward sounds like a Bushism, I'm sorry. The answer here is reasonably straightforward. Dominants prevent them from breeding. The subordinate females have to stay, and dominants don't allow them to breed. And they do this either by suppressing, or by a combination of suppressing their physiological development, by evicting them from the group, particularly if they try and breed, or killing their offspring if they do manage to breed. The issue of suppression is a bit complicated, because suppression is also affected by the absence of unrelated males. If we compare estradiol levels in females in their natal group, and if we take away the dominant female, we reduce suppression and their estradiol levels go up. But if we leave them with related males, it doesn't go up all that much. But if we take away the dominant female and give them access to unrelated males, estradiol levels go up even more. So that there's an interaction here between the presence of unrelated males, potential breeding partners, and the dominant female. The presence of the dominant female is important in terms of suppression, but so is the absence of unrelated males. So they evict them commonly. I've already told you that dominant females evict all female subordinates roughly by the time they're 3.5 years old. And dominants also selectively evict, meaning they evict earlier on average heavier individuals, pregnant subordinates, and more distant relatives. If they stay and if they attempt to breed, and if they don't evict them, dominants commonly kill their babies. And they commonly kill their babies, especially if the dominant female, is pregnant, so that the dominant female's pups would be born after the subordinates and would be lighter to them. So here's a remarkable picture taken by Andy Young of a grandmother killing one of her grandchildren. This is not uncommon. This is a regular feature of meerkat society. It's usually the case. Most of the females are the offspring of the dominant females. When female infanticide occurs, it's commonly grandmothers killing their grand offspring. And they do this particularly if they're pregnant, so that the proportion of offspring surviving, if the dominant is pregnant, is the proportion of offspring born to subordinate members who survive, allowed to survive. If the dominant is in late pregnancy, is very, very low. If the dominant isn't pregnant, around 60% of pups, 60% of litters and 60% of pups are allowed to survive. So dominants kill subordinate pups if subordinate pups are likely to threaten their own offspring. So that obviously raises a question. The question is, why do you kill your own grandchildren? And the presumption is that there is competition between pups in the group, and that if you don't kill your own grandchildren, your offspring, who are more closely related to you, will suffer. And here there's evidence that that is the case, so that if the dominant breeds alone, the pup-weighted independence of her pups is consistently higher than if a subordinate is breeding at the same time. And the weighted emergence of pups is a major factor affecting their survival and their eventual breeding success. So we wanted to show that this was not, that this relationship was causal, and we did what in retrospect was really a quite enormous experiment, in the sense that it took a lot of time, and for half a breeding season we turned off all subordinate females with DPP injections, which stopped them breeding during the time. So we had experimental groups where all subordinates had been prevented from breeding, and those other with control ones where they were allowed to breed. And we found, as expected, that it was the case that pups born into groups where subordinates were prevented from breeding were heavier. So here's the treatment. As I say, was turn off all the subordinates by 2 successive injections of DPP, and as you can see, the treatment where the subordinates were off, the pups were heavier at independence. And interestingly, there was an effect on mothers too, so that the mother's weight at the date that she conceived was higher in groups where we had removed the threat of subordinate breeding from her. So presumably that reflects some sort of energetic investment in mothers in preventing subordinates from breeding. So subordinates can't disperse because it's just too costly. Subordinates can't breed because their mother prevents them. And the remaining of the 3 questions is, why do they help? And this is in a sense, the $10,000 question for cooperative species. And here I think the important thing to realize is that what you should be looking at in thinking about the costs of helping are the marginal costs of helping. They should not include the costs of not dispersing or not breeding, because your best chance of surviving and doing this, of maximizing your direct fitness, is to remain and to hope that someone eats your mother. So why do helpers help? Well, the answer is roughly this, that helpers benefit recipients. Show you data in a moment. Breeding success rises with helper number, and helpers are close relatives, usually sibs, as I showed you at the outset, of helpers. Now, if you look at breeding groups, you weigh them repeatedly, as we've done, you find, unsurprisingly, that as the number of helpers per pup increases, pup food intake rises, and so does their daily weight gain. So where groups that have lots of helpers, particularly lots of helpers relative to pups, show high growth rate of pups, and growth, as I've told you, is related to pup survival and pup breeding success. Now, the problem with correlational data like that is that there are other ways in which you might generate those relationships. So, for example, if it was the case that there were big differences in territory quality between groups, you might find a situation where groups on high territories had relatively large numbers of helpers because helpers survived better, and they independently had higher food intake rates in pups because the territory was better. So we did an experiment to investigate this, and we, over quite short periods of time, we removed pups from some groups, thereby increasing the ratio of resident helpers to pups, and we added them to other litters, thereby reducing the ratio of resident helpers to pups. And if you do that, if you do that, if you reduce resident litters, thereby increasing the ratio of helpers to pups, you increase pup weight gain, and if you increase litters by adding extra pups, thereby reducing the ratio of helpers to pups, you reduce pup weight gain. So I think these are causal relationships here that are driving the weight increases, and we further went on to ask whether the amount of helping that was done, whether the amount of feeding was done actually increased pup survival by feeding some litters, by mimicking helpers and artificially feeding pups ourselves. And we were able to show that if we feed pups over the period of growth, their weighted independence is higher and their survival is higher too. So helping, I think, is, the animals really do help, and there are real causal relationships. So they're raising individuals, they are contributing, the helpers are contributing to the growth and survival and eventual reproductive success of other individuals in the group that are produced that are close relatives. But the benefits of helping, oh, and I should also say that helpers adjust what they do to helpers are quite finely tuned. They don't just go into this blind. They adjust what they give to pups to their needs, so that the proportion of time that the pups spend begging is related to how much, to the tendency for helpers to feed them. Begging is there's honest begging in pups, which controls the amount of help, of feeding that the helpers do. And pup begging calls play an important role here. So we did playback experiments which showed if we play back pup begging calls, we increase the proportion of food items given by helpers, by group members to pups. It's interesting too that if we play back pup begging calls, we increase the cortisol levels of helpers as well. So there's a suggestion there that cortisol is involved in helping. Helpers, the presence of helpers doesn't just benefit pups, it also benefits breeders. As helper number increases, the amount of work that the amount of work that breeders have to do declines. So dominant females do progressively less work as there are more helpers there to take the work on for them. This has effects that this increases the breeding rate of dominant females. They can produce more litters a year. It reduces the interbreeding interval. Presence of helpers has many other benefits to breeders and which are shared with other group members. So members of large groups benefit because they're more likely to be a sentinel on duty when they are foraging, and members of large groups show reduced mortality. The probability of dying among adults is reduced in large groups. It's also the case that, as in quite a lot of other social species, large groups are able to respond and to defend their territories against smaller groups. So bigger groups erode the territories of neighboring groups and take them over. And then a consideration that is relatively seldom thought about in many of these species concerns the probability of groups generating new groups. Really, the right measure of fitness in many of these cases should not be the breeding success of individuals within groups, but should be how many new groups do they start. So ultimately it relates to the fitness of dispersers. Now, only large groups can produce large splinters of females at any one time, or the probability small groups may do so occasionally, but not commonly. So large groups produce larger dispersing splinters of females, for obvious reasons that unless you have a relatively large group, you have few individuals to disperse at the same time. And large dispersing splinters in these systems are much more likely to disperse successfully and start new breeding groups. So individuals in small splinters are very susceptible to predation. They're consequently unable to feed successfully when they are dispersing. So here for dispersers of different, for splinters, there's a dispersing group of different sizes, is the hourly rate of weight gain. So small single dispersers, or those dispersing in a splinter of 2, consistently lose weight, and the daily weight gain increases very closely in relation to splinter size. And there are also effects of splinter size on cortisol levels. So individuals dispersing alone or in pairs have whacking great high cortisol levels. That goes through the roof. They're extremely scared, and that goes down with increasing splinter size. And then to complete this, the probability of dispersing groups settling is much higher for large groups, large splinters, than for small ones. And this may be a vital importance in the evolution of sociality and helping in meerkats, because what these relationships suggest is that small groups produce very few new successfully dispersing females. So if you're a meerkat, if you're a subordinate meerkat, your best chance is to stay at home. You can't breed because your mother's stopping you. You help because there are general benefits to helping. So one of the final question, I think, here is helping really costly? And it's always been assumed that helping is costly, and many models of helping have assumed that there is a fixed cost to helping that is which is paid by all helpers, and that inhibits in the models the evolution of cooperation. But helping isn't like that. Helping in these systems and in all the other cooperative breeders where it's been looked at is conditional. So if you have plenty of resources, if you're a well-fed individual, you help more, and if you're a poorly fed individual, you can't afford the time and effort to help, you do much less. So if you look at helpers, I'm sorry, we're just off. This is the proportion of your food you give to pups. This is increasing as your daily weight gain increases. And if we feed helpers, raising their nutritional level, they give away an increased number of prey items to pups. There is some energetic cost to helpers in the sense that those that help a lot don't grow as fast, so that if we divide helpers into those that help little, medium or high, the growth rates of the helpers that give away relatively little food or babysit little are higher than for those that do relatively high amounts of work. So there is a cost to helper growth, which is there in both sexes, but we're unable to find any fitness costs of helping. So if we look at these same low, medium and high individuals, we don't find differences in survival between them. One issue, in many of the cooperative species, or in some of the cooperative species, there's some evidence of discrimination, of helpers selectively helping the closest kin. In meerkats, this doesn't appear to be the case. There's no relationship between the amount of work they do and how closely they are individually related to the pups. They don't adjust. There's no discriminatory helping in relation to kinship or nepotism within groups. This doesn't, of course, mean that kin selection isn't operating, because all these animals are very closely related to each other. And as Charlie Cornwallis and Stu West have recently shown, the degree of discrimination in cooperative breeders generally declines as the extent of relatedness increases. So the point here is, if you're very closely related to other individuals in the group, there's really not that much point in being discriminatory. And of course, the added benefits to everyone of helping and of the presence of helpers will also favor no close relationship between this. So if you put this together, I've talked about cases where we help, where the helpers have an effect on other group members, so they have a shared effect on other group members. And this raises the question as to whether it is possible to generate these systems of altruistic cooperation in unrelated individuals. And Martin Novak, among other people, has suggested that it's quite possible to generate cooperative breeding and cooperation of this kind, altruistic cooperation of this kind, where individuals are unrelated to each other, if the costs, if the benefits of cooperation to all group members are sufficiently large. And with Rufus Johnson and Hannah Coker, we modeled this situation some time ago, 10 years ago, and showed that if the benefits of helping, if the effects of helping are high enough, you can get helping being maintained, even if helping has some costs. But, however, it's much easier to get this if you're dealing with situations where there's a reasonably high degree of relatedness between group members. So it's much easier. It is conceivably possible for the general group-related benefits to maintain helping, as I've just said, but it's much easier to do it if there's a reasonably high degree of relatedness than if there is no relatedness. And as I showed you in the early stages of the lecture, cooperative breeding of this kind is actually confined to individuals with high relatedness. So I'm now going to shift to finally talk about what are the consequences of cooperative breeding. And one is that breeding females in cooperative species have very high fecundity and show very high levels of reproductive success. They've as I described in the last lecture, in these species, meerkats can produce 3 litters a year with an average size of 5, so that a breeding meerkat can, in theory, produce about 150 of surviving offspring in their lifetime. Mole rats produce even larger litters, and the breeding female can do up to 600 in her lifetime. The magnitude of breeding success is related to the tenure of females, so that the lifetime breeding success of females increases with their tenure, as does males. Females have longer tenure than males, so variation as a result of that is higher than variance in females. So that they're one of the few cases where lifetime variance in female success is greater than lifetime variance in male success. And this was a surprise to me. I've been used to working on polygynous species. I'd grown up in a situation where you expected high levels of variance in reproductive success in animals like red deer or elephant seals, where particular harem males held lots of females. And actually what we see in meerkats, the variance in female success that we see in meerkats is way higher the upper levels of female success that we find in meerkats is way higher than anything found in the most polygynous animals that anyone's found in males. So here is the comparison. Our top red deer stag did 30 breeding, produced 30 offspring during its lifetime. But the numbers are restricted because these have relatively short breeding careers. As I told you last time, the greater the degree of polygyny, the shorter the male career. Our most successful female meerkat has reared 81 surviving offspring during their lives. So huge variance in reproductive success generates intense competition between females for breeding success. This generates consistently higher aggression in females than in males. So females at all ages are more competitive with each other. Females are commonly dominant to males in these systems. Female tenure is vitally important, and female tenure is related to the difference in weight between the breeding female and the heaviest subordinate. So if the difference in weight is relatively large, females have long tenure and high breeding success. So tenure seriously matters. So if you're a breeding female and you inherit the breeding position and you have a subordinate female in the group that's close to your own weight, you are at serious risk of having a short tenure and being thrown out and being relatively unsuccessful. So what might you do about that? Well, what female meerkats who acquire the dominant position do is they go in for a period of escalated growth over the next 4 to 5 months of their first period as a dominant. So here's an example of a particular dominant female who acquires dominance at this stage, and woo, up her weight gain goes. So there's a period of very rapid growth after a dominant female acquires the dominant position. Now, evidence from other species suggests that rapid growth like this, escalated growth, has real costs to aging, has costs to telomere length and oxidative stress and various reasons, and that escalated growth has costs. So you may not go in for this. You might think about going in for this unless you really needed to. You really need to, of course, if you have a situation where the subordinate is relatively close to you in weight. Whereas if you're already substantially heavier than the subordinate, you don't need to. The magnitude of this increases as the initial difference in weight between the subordinate female and the heaviest subordinate increases. So if you have a situation where you inherit the dominant position, your heaviest subordinate is close to you in weight, you go in for a relatively high increment in growth over this period compared to a situation where you start with an initially large difference in weight between you and your subordinate. This made us wonder what was happening in meerkat queues, because in meerkat queues you have multiple breeding females that are waiting to take over the dominant female, and if you're a dominant female in this queue and your sister, your younger sister, starts to outgrow you, she may take over your position in the queue with huge consequences for your fitness. So we wondered in the second case whether something like this might be going on between subordinate females too. So we did an experiment where, in considerable numbers, both of juveniles and adults in queues, we identified pairs of sisters, and we experimentally fed the younger sister to a point where it increased her growth rate, and we monitored the effect of this on the growth and food intake of the older sister. This is one of those experiments which I didn't think would work, but which did in fact come out. So the issue here, this shows the weight gain of adults if their rival, this is the weight gain of the older sister who was unfed, if their rival, their younger sister, was fed. And among adults there's a substantial, in both males and in females, there's a substantial increment in the weight of individuals who have their, whose younger challengers, whose younger rivals are fed. And that applies in juveniles too, significant but to a lesser extent. And this is associated with increases in daily weight gain which reflect food intake rate, so that if the rival is fed, the daily weight gain of individuals, their food intake, goes up in both sexes. Again, there's a lesser effect in juveniles. So it does look as if one of the adaptations in this system is that individuals are going in for competitive growth, and when they're challenged, they're increasing their food intake rate and they're increasing their daily weight gain. So in meerkats, individuals compete like fury, particularly females compete like fury, because there's very, very strong selection to get to the breeding position. The breeding position offers great possibilities. So that in these systems you find unusually high levels of female-female competition, and these are associated with complex strategies of dealing with that. I'd just like to leave you by saying that meerkats are not the only cooperative system. The cooperative systems of other mongooses are not all the same. They're quite widely variable. The other ones that have been studied are here, but I'm really just going to say something very briefly about banded mongooses, which are currently being worked on by Mike Kant and his group. And I told you at the beginning, they live in more mesic areas. Multiple females breed, and apparently the ancestral condition was monogamy, and they've lost monogamy. And they have a number of seriously interesting differences from meerkats. Both sexes breed in their natal group. Multiple females breed in near-perfect synchrony. Near-perfect synchrony, they effectively breed on the same day. And if they don't breed on the same day, they're very likely to get their offspring killed by other group members. So there's a fantastic degree of synchrony here, and it's the case that pups born out of synchrony are usually killed. And finally, pups are fed not by all group members, but by dedicated male helpers. So each pup has its own helper. And if the helper is absent, the pup doesn't get fed. And if the pup is absent, the helper doesn't feed anyone else. Totally different situation to meerkats. And the point that I'd want to make is there's a wide range of systems in here. They're not all the same. We don't understand many of the reasons for these differences, so there's a lot that remains to be done. So in summary, cooperative breeding in mammals evolves in monogamous species that produce litters and living in challenging environments. Dispersal costs are high, and subordinate females are prevented from breeding by dominance, so that helping is their only way of increasing their fitness. Helpers increment the survival and growth of offspring, the fecundity of breeding individuals, and survival of all group members, generating considerable shared benefits. Cooperative breeding is associated with large differences in lifetime reproductive success between females, intense competition to breed, as well as with unusual adaptations that increment the competitive ability of females. And then as a final point, there's lots of diversity in these systems still there that we don't understand. Thank you very much for listening.
So Tim will take questions. Do you have any?
So Tim, from the experiment where you removed the ability of the subordinates to get pregnant, right?
Yep.
Just right before that, you had showed the difference in weight gain if you were part of a group where a subordinate had a litter at the same time as the dominant.
Yep.
So is that effect what's driving the effect when you experimentally made it so they couldn't get pregnant, or is there some additional effect, like they can detect the ability?
I suspect it's that effect that is dominant, but there still is, the second point that I showed is that there's an added benefit to the dominant female's own weight of not having subordinate. which suggests that there's a cost in continuing to control subordinates. So I think there are two factors there. That was a huge experiment. I mean, if you can imagine, and we were doing this with a dozen groups in each category, in each of the cases, and we were turning off all the subordinate females in each group by 2 injections. But I don't know whether it was worth it, but we did it. Andy.
Tell us more about the sort of female-female dynamics that occur before a takeover occurs. So it sounds like if you want to be the next biggest female, but if you get too close to the other female, she might evict you, but you need to be reasonably close to her, or else actually there won't be a takeover at all.
Yeah, that's right.
So how does all this sort of sort out? Have you seen enough takeovers to get a sense of a clear pattern on how or why do you ever get situations?
If your mother gets a cold, if your mother gets ill, you tip her out. So they're extremely opportunistic, and if the dominant female suffers a disadvantage, she's immediately at risk and no one else will help her. So unlike primates, they don't go in for coalitions. You may just get her biggest daughter attacking her, and we see that occurring. The commonest case of transfer is, given that predation rates are high, is that just someone eats the dominant female. And so the predation rates are in the order of 20% per year. So there's a reasonably high rate of loss of dominant females just from predation. Then finally, it is the case that takeovers are particularly common shortly after a dominant female has acquired the breeding position. So that during that time there's a particularly high risk.
But if the dominant female loses her position, does the dominant male then have to disperse?
Yes. If the dominant female loses her position, you have a dominant male who is then closely related in most cases to all other group members, and he leaves. Whether the trigger is relatedness or familiarity is difficult to tell. We have had one case where a dominant female died. Shortly afterwards, the group split. Dominant male doesn't leave immediately. They're commonly a few months before he leaves. The group split, so we had 2 subgroups living in different areas, and the dominant male wandered away, and the first females he bumped into were his own daughters in another subgroup. And no one appeared to recognize anyone, and they all lived happily ever afterwards. Not ever afterwards, but at any rate for some time. So I'm reluctant. I suspect that familiarity in many of these systems plays a role, and it's difficult to distinguish between that effect and a direct effect of relatedness recognition.
So in the case where there is a takeover, does the dominant who's displaced stay on as a helper or disperse or get killed?
Does the dominant
who is displaced, if there is a takeover and the dominant is not dead?
They're common, very occasionally they stay on. They're usually evicted. They're usually evicted. They're sometimes killed.
So I know that the naked mole rat is long-lived, and I also know you mentioned 60% mortality 1 year of the adults. But are these generally long-lived?
No.
They are not.
No. These are. They can live up to about 10 or 12 years, which is about what you'd expect. The evolution of unusually long lifespans in these cooperative breeders is, I think, confined to species where the breeding female is fed by other group members and so doesn't have to forage herself. And so meerkats, the breeding females forage, they're constantly exposed to extrinsic risks of mortality. And you don't get these very long breeding lifespans. There is a question about naked mole rats. So naked mole rats, the claim is that females can live for 25 years and live much longer than subordinates. But what we don't, all the data on naked mole rats come from lab colonies. And we really don't know to what extent the shorter lifespans of subordinates in these species is a direct consequence of aggression from the dominant female rather than from intrinsic differences in aging rate.
So so the 60% mortality, when you have that, it's a reshuffling every few months of your pecking order.
Yeah. Well, it depends. I gave you 60% mortality across the whole group, in the course of a year, not 60% per month.
No, I understand.
So quite a high proportion dominant, but that was in the original population where predation was very, very high. In these populations, it's somewhere around 20% mortality that we're doing. So there's a reasonably high loss rate of dominant females, and that predation mortality doesn't appear to be very closely related to phenotypic differences that we can see. Monique?
Yeah, I have two questions. First of all, it seems like you want to get rid of your mum. Is there any evidence that the sentinels guard less when the mums are around?
No, I'd love to think that. I think that's you'd suspect a primate of doing that.
Yeah, right.
That would be a surprising effect. Nice idea. Primatological question, perhaps even a human behavioural ecology.
The other question is, you're following so many different groups, which is really cool because you've got all this data, but you always put the groups together and just compare them on group size or tenure length or whatever. Are there any observations you've made, even sort of qualitatively, about just some of these groups are just different, like their cultural differences that are transmitted, or because you've got so much variation, and then the Mike-Counts animals are so different, you'd expect there'd be some sort of natural variability.
Well, we've looked for differences in feeding, and we haven't found differences in feeding, and we've looked for differences in vocalization, we haven't found differences in vocalization, but we have found differences in one important thing, and that's the time that they get up in the morning. So some groups, they get up at dawn and start foraging, and some groups stay in bed for a longer time than others, and that is consistent across quite long periods, and individuals who come from an early rising group and move into a late rising group become lazy in turn and don't get out of bed either.
I too have a couple of questions. Well, I just thought of a couple more. First is, have you done a variety of things in the way of experimenting with further advantaging or handicapping dominant breeding females to see the influence on dynamics and fate? And even more generally, I suppose, can you comment on what you may think are the key correlates of personal history, genetic, environmental, group structure, etc., that influence the probability of becoming a dominant breeder?
Dominant breeders are likely to be the offspring of other dominant breeders, so the offspring of subordinates are less likely to acquire dominant positions. Otherwise, I think there's a big issue of serendipity in acquiring dominant positions. What was the first part of your question?
The first one was, have you done any more
we've fed
things
dominant
to
females.
breeders?
If we feed dominant females, we increase their breeding rate, and we're just doing an experiment to see whether we also increase their aggressiveness.
Any things to handicap them in order to...
No, I think that'd be difficult.
I think we're going to be handicapping Tim unless we let him go. It's been a long day. So thank you very much.